Welcome to the Deep End at Wesleyan. This is a new podcast series exploring the ways that faculty, teachers, scholars at North Carolina Wesleyan bring their research and scholarly work into the classroom to enrich and enliven our students' education. My name is Joe Lane, and I'm honored to be the Provost and Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at North Carolina Wesleyan. In the 3 years that I've led the academic program here, I've been so encouraged to see our faculty actively engaged in leading work in their fields, and I'm excited to bring their stories to our listeners. If you're an alum, trustee, or friend of Wesleyan, you should be very proud to see the work our faculty are doing. If you're a student or a prospective student, I hope you'll hear something that catches your ear and your interest. Perhaps you can find a professor whose class you would like to take or whose research team you would like to join. If you're a faculty member at Wesleyan, I hope you'll be impressed with the work your colleagues are doing and will consider coming on a future episode to tell us what you are up to. Today, in our inaugural episode, we'll begin with Dr. Shane Thompson, Assistant Professor of Religion and Biblical and Near Eastern Studies. Dr. Thompson, as we will discuss, was recently honored by the Archaeological Institute of America as one of their Kershaw Lecturers for the 24-25 year. And we will explore some of what this means and what Dr. Thompson is covering in his lectures in just a moment. Dr. Thompson, welcome to the pod.
Happy to be here.
Tell us a little bit about the broad outlines of your work and how you got into studying what you study.
Sure. So I work on kind of variety of things. I consider myself to be a generalist in the best way, not in the worst way, which some people take that to be a bad thing. So I work on things as broad as I have some projects going on right now on game metaphors in ancient Mesopotamian texts, both Sumerian and Akkadian. Kind of my traditional training is in Israelite religion, so Iron Age Israel from about 1000 to 600 BCE. I also do a decent bit of Egyptian and Hittite sorts of things, but I think my true love is late Bronze Age Syria, so from about 1500 to 1200, and these very popular sites of Amar and Ugarit, which everyone's familiar with. I don't even think we probably need to talk about them.
Yeah,
everybody probably knows everything anyway.
Nobody needs a map to find Agar. We all know what Agar is.
So I got into this kind of weird. I was at an undergrad institution where I also had to take a religious studies class. I was lucky enough to do so while I was studying abroad. And so I took my intro to the Bible class while I was in London and got to go on field trips to see cool stuff. Obviously not Bible stuff, but we're going to need to see stained glass windows in Cambridge and things of that sort. And realized that maybe this was for me instead of continuing to do, at that time I was really into Civil War history and into Native American religions, which I ended up doing my undergrad basically in Native American religion, that maybe this was for me. But I brought a lot of that into what I do. So when I was doing Native American religion, I spent a summer living on a reservation, observing the performance of ritual and talking to real people. So I think I have a rather unique take on my field because I have studied living people in the past. So a lot of what I think about is the performance of lived religion as opposed to things that we just dug up in the sand or just that exist on a clay tablet or on the page.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Now, you have an awful lot of master's degrees.
I do.
I think probably the most I've ever seen on one CV. So what kept you in school for so long, and why so many stops on your academic odyssey?
Yeah, so this is one of the, I don't want to bring it down at the beginning of this podcast. My field is not the most popular on the hiring block these days, and there's really only a handful of places that you're getting hired out of, and to be able to get into one of those, people have the resumes like that. You do a master's in kind of broader religious studies, so I did one basically in ritual theory because that's what I'm interested in. Then typically go to a divinity school for usually an MTS, but some people will do an MDiv. That would have been mine was in Hebrew Bible, and then I did a master's in ancient Near Eastern studies because what I do requires the mastery, or at least the ability to use so many different languages that they expect you from day one to be able to work in most of those, and then also to have some archaeological fieldwork experience and be able to work in material culture too. So I guess either stupidity or the love of academia kept me into it. Just the love of what I do. I am fortunate, as I say often, to have made a hobby into a career.
There you go. And just for the record, how many languages would you say you're basically proficient in? If you had a dictionary?
If I have a dictionary and a grammar, I think there's about 22 on my CV. But some of those, we have 6 lines of text from the whole Moabite or Edomite. There's not a huge corpus there.
And did you always know that this study would lead you into teaching? And what about teaching at North Carolina Wesleyan did you find attractive?
Yeah, so I always wanted to be at a school like this. I grew up in a family. My mom taught at a community college. My dad adjuncted while he was, at night after his day job, and they both loved teaching. I went to a liberal arts college myself, and I was just drawn. I've always been drawn to smaller institutions. I've never fit in at the bigger places. And I learn just as much from my students as I think they learn from me. You should see my notes after a course are like journal article ideas from things that have come up in class. So it's just as beneficial to me as it is to them. And then, I am from the area, sort of, and getting back into the Carolinas was always a dream of mine. So I was lucky enough that one of the very few jobs in my field opened up somewhere geographically that I wanted to be at the type of institution that I wanted to be at.
Fantastic. You may be one of the very few people out there who had the privilege to be both a bishop and a deacon.
Right, yeah, I know, right? They look alike, similar colors, both yellow/gold. Yeah, I check all the boxes.
There you go. So tell us about the Kershaw Lectures. This is a pretty heady appointment. How were you selected for this series, and where are you going to be speaking?
Yeah, so it came as a bit of a surprise. At the time, I was not even a member of the Archaeological Institute of America. Out of the numerous academic societies that we're a part of, that was one that dropped off at some point for me because I wasn't attending the conferences and things like that. They had become a bit more kind of American archaeology heavy, just not doing stuff that I do. So I'd been going to more field-specific things. I got an email in May that I had been nominated for this. It was cool. Push it off to the side and expect not to hear anything again. And then I got an email, maybe it was a little before that, but I got an email, I guess, in June or July that I had been selected, and let's go from there. So that was cool. I know right now, I think there are 2 of us right now. It's me and Eric Klein, who I think has the #1 book on Amazon right now. So some company, some pretty big company to keep up with there. So I'm giving 5 lectures. I've already given talks at William & Mary and Johns Hopkins, and then I have a talk at the University of Tennessee. Those are this fall semester, and the next semester I'm giving talks at the University of Georgia and UNC Greensboro. So there were some other options, but we are a teaching institution. I can't cancel class for weeks at a time.
No, that's true. You can't cancel class for weeks at a time. And what kind of audience do you draw when you go out to speak in a Kershaw lecture setting? It's
been different. So William & Mary was a gigantic audience of all undergrads. We're talking more than 80. It could have been as many as 100 that were there. And then Hopkins was, I think, 0 undergrads, and they have a giant grad program in our field, one of the better respected ones historically. So it was all grad students and professors who very much knew what I was talking about, as opposed to people who didn't. So kind of crafting lectures for those kinds of audiences when I'm trying to kind of give the same lecture or not write 5 new lectures is a little difficult because you don't really know what the audience is going to be. You want them to understand you, but if it's an audience that knows what you're talking about, you also want to show that you're progressing the field in some way. So it's been difficult, I think, but it's been fun.
That's super. Well, let's go a little deeper into what you're trying to do. If
Sure.
We're going to summarize a point you want to make in your Kershaw lectures. What is it you're aiming for? What concept do you want your audience to take away and have some fluency with that they would not have had otherwise?
Sure. So I would say I'll answer that with 2 things. So
sure.
The first would be how to, or maybe new ways to attempt to locate non-elites in the ancient world. Most of our evidence, if not 99% of our evidence, is from elite peoples who were writing about elite things. And that's cool. That's what people are interested in. That's what brings in the tourism. And that's what, makes you stop on the History Channel show that has a big pyramid on it when you're flipping channels.
Right.
But that's the small portion of society. I'm interested in regular people and how to find those people. And it's hard. These people didn't write the places that they lived, or not the places that are getting funded, because they're not going to make a cool tourist site. So that is one thing that I'm interested in. The other one is that I've always been a methodological, theoretical person, and one thing that has driven me crazy is the use of the term imperialism and empire and those sorts of things when talking about the ancient world without thinking about what that means. So these we use very modern concepts, which we should. We don't have anything else to use.
Those are the concepts we have.
Those are the concepts we have, right? But in using them, you need to think about their baggage and what they mean. So this project, which most of this project was already done and was a part of my first book, but is methodologically extending into some other work that's coming out. Something's coming out next month. Thinking about how to think past empire and imperialism, and in doing so, also how to find the non-elites through these theoretical approaches.
Great. Well, I want to pick up on the non-elites in a second, but let's pick up on empire for a
Sure.
moment, because when we study empires in introductory college classes, a lot of times the first thing you go to is a map, and the extent of the Hittite Empire is here, and the extent of the Roman Empire is there, and the Babylonian Empire, and you draw a map and you say, here's where it is.
Yep.
And I've noticed in reading a couple of the things you've done that you're very interested in that idea of boundary markers and boundary practices,
Yep.
where things begin, where they end. Tell us a little bit about your approach to that, and does it trouble that simple idea we have of, I can color in this part of the map and those are the Hittites?
It certainly makes that problematic, right? So these are people groups that are interested primarily in the economy. So if you have to jump 100 miles to get to the next place that has something of value, then you jump. So we're talking more about nodes of power, and Egypt, for instance, may skip all of some part of Palestine to get into Syria or something like that. So when we color in these, and I use them in slides too, because they're nice, pretty maps, right?
Yeah.
But when we see these, they're not 100% accurate by any means. So how do we find these things? There are some ways. Archaeologically, we look for boundary markers, or what we think are boundary markers, and the interpretation of things is a whole slippery slope as well. But people groups tended, especially military groups, tended to set up commemoration stones of major battles, and now we're in charge of this, or a king saying, "Look, you're my subjects now." So we look for those sorts of things, and we can look for influence, even in the smaller scale material culture sorts of things, which I have pushed back against, but that some people certainly still use. So all of a sudden there are Mesopotamian or Assyrian objects showing up somewhere. Well, what does that mean? Well, this either means contact, usually in my opinion, but some people would say that means, well, the Mesopotamian, Assyrians, Babylonians, whoever it may be at the time, are now in charge there. So these are difficult things to locate, and the battle we're always fighting is that most of our evidence comes from the core or the homelands of these places, who are always going to say, of course, yeah, we control all this land and we're the greatest ever and we're the most powerful ever. Well, now let's go look and see if that was the case. And I feel like scholarship has relied too much on the material from these homelands, which, it is 99% of our material. A lot of times there's not anything else to look at, but we still need to ask the questions. They say they're doing this, what were they actually doing?
Right. We see the gigantic carving of the king on the side of the mountain.
Right.
With the pronouncement in 4 different languages saying, I'm ruling over all of this. And, and we take his word for it.
Right. Yeah, you say so. Right. Yeah.
Who is it going to say that they were ruling over all of this regardless?
Right. Right.
But that, of course, raises an interesting question, which I think goes back to where you started, the idea of working on the ritual practices of Native Americans. Would you say it's fair that in some ways we live in the very first era, or maybe 150, 200 years ago would get to one of the very first eras where the material life, the day-to-day practices of non-elites gets preserved because photography all of a sudden makes it possible that we have images that show the life of lots of people, not just the rich and famous.
Yeah, I would say that's 100% accurate. I mean, most of the time on excavations that I'm on or have been on, the only thing we're finding other than, walls of houses, maybe we'll find a kitchen, so we'll find a stove or an oven or something like that and some bones of what they were eating. The only thing we're really finding are things like loom weights. So they made clothes. Well, that's a pretty good assumption that they weren't all wandering around without clothes on. It is a gap in the record. It is something that even in mythological text or narrative text and things of that sort, they're not talking about non-elites either. So it's a huge gap, and it's just something we have to try to fill the best we can. It's hard. And sometimes it's impossible, but it's a worthy avenue to at least try to go down.
So talk a little bit about the methodologies that you and other scholars that you're working with would use to try to get at, those vanished pieces of culture, or the dance you could see on a Native American reservation for a people that's lived there within the last 100 years, but that you don't have access to some film of that 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, so one way that I approached this project was through looking at the census, and while we may not have things from the non-elites, we have the culture they were in. So what would they have been seeing? What would they have witnessed, right? So in approaching my materials that I was interested in, I am looking at things like what public rituals were performed, what public iconography, so inscriptions and carvings and statues and border markers or whatever, were out there that everyone could have seen, and especially are located in places everyone was going to see, like at the city gate or something like that, not in the inner room of the ambassador's house or something like that, right? The normal person's not going to be in that room. So that doesn't, the elites knew that there were other powerful people from other places there, but did, Joe on the street corner know?
Right.
Well, let's see what we can find out from what we can read about public performance and public art and public iconography and these sorts of things. So that is one way that I've been going about doing this. I think it has given some results, which is better than nothing.
And what kind of results are you finding? I mean, what would you say are some of the more remarkable insights or records that you've had access to and been able to talk about?
Yeah, so I think that this, I would say, proved for some of the Mesopotamian-controlled areas that Neo-Assyrians, for instance, were not trying to impose their culture on local peoples. They didn't care as long as they were getting paid. On the other hand, if you look at somewhere maybe like the Hittite Empire, people had thought that the Hittites were kind of hands-off in their dealings with people, and I think maybe that's not correct. We see some new rituals pop up that don't really look like they should be happening in Syria, but they're very clearly public rituals being led by non-native peoples. So maybe in Syria, the Hittites were more hands-on than we thought, and did care if the local peoples were maybe worshiping Hittite gods in addition to their own. So these are some valuable insights that they let us see where gods pop up. A lot of times we don't know the origin points of certain gods. I mean, there are still people arguing over where Yahweh comes from. Maybe this is where we find him sometime, right? So we can hope.
Right, and of course, in doing so, do you try to bring forward the idea of the ancient Near East as a much more pluralist and interconnected world than one that we might think about when we draw the maps and, here be Israel, here be Egypt?
Sure. Yeah, I think people forget how small some of these areas are, right? So when you say, oh, why is all this Egyptian stuff showing up in Israel? Well, they're like 100 miles away from each other. It's not weird when I run into a Virginia license plate in North Carolina, right? So that's not odd at all. I am certainly not the first to promote an idea of kind of the global nature of the late Bronze and Iron Age Eastern Mediterranean, but I am certainly a proponent of that and have an article coming out next month that's promoting that as well. That really, this is just the first time in history that we see all of these cultures, and a lot of them major powerful cultures, in contact with one another and trading with one another and intermarrying with one another, and that makes things move around, not just stuff, but also ideas and gods, and it's a very cool time, I think.
Yeah. How much do you think ritual played into the dynamic between these different societies that are intertwining and having both conflict and cooperation with one another?
I think I've been saying this probably since I was one of my master's student. Taking the words from Captain Bell, who was one of the saints of ritual studies, that ritual creates power, and I think these folks are performing rituals to try to show that they're at the top of the hierarchy, and it is both a political and a religious statement, right? We're kind of recreating the hierarchy in the heavens as well. A lot of these folks thought they were actual gods too, especially in places like Egypt. So you are reinforcing that, especially when a foreign group comes into your land. You're dressing up as the god that you are, and you're surrounded by all the iconography that shows that you are a god. I mean, luckily in Egypt, all that stuff is still there. Even if you just go to Egypt, you can see that displayed, that a god is represented as Osiris or as Horus or something like that, right? Unfortunately, in Mesopotamia and places like that, most of that is no longer there, but Egypt is a good place to look at those kinds of things, and the rituals performed at these sites were certainly meant to reinforce those sorts of power hierarchies, and I think a lot of them were probably reinforced not only for locals but also for visitors too.
And this may be a reach, and feel free to say no. There's probably not much there, but I think myself, coming up through a Christianized education for the most part, that there was a strong suggestion that there was something really special about Jerusalem, and that it tried to kind of inscribe onto a physical space, onto a city, a picture of the true order of the cosmos, and that somehow this was this great insight, that Jerusalem was this great city. Was that common among these cities that you?
Oh yeah, I mean, you see these sorts of things everywhere. You can pinpoint even how, and maybe this isn't exactly what you're asking, so feel free to tell me. You can see in the layout of the city of Jerusalem that all of a sudden, right, you go from even in the biblical text, God is talking to the Israelites, and all of a sudden God's talking to the king. Right. And you see that in the layout of the city. Once Jerusalem is this city with a monarchy, well, what's right between the temple and the people is the palace.
Is the palace.
Right? So you can see it's laid out that way, and that's a pretty typical layout of a city in the ancient world. You see similar things happening. Long been argued that Marduk in Mesopotamia becomes the chief god after they have, for a millennia or more, had three gods at the top, because all of a sudden everywhere has one king. So now we need one god because we're a reflection of the cosmos, and we see a similar thing then happening in Jerusalem. Yeah.
Right. And do you think in the work that you're doing and other scholars working with you are able to kind of see some of these trends ripple through different political social units? Kind of in parallel or sequence, or
yes and no.
Yes and no.
Yes. Well, I maybe we're too ingrained in our own worlds to always see it in other places. I always say they are happening in parallel. Things like the switch to monotheism. We always look only at Israel. The little bit of evidence that we have from the Transjordan, so in Edomite, Moabite, Ammonite societies, these concurrent civilizations that are living there, right, it looks like they all of a sudden are only worshiping one god too. So it's why these things happen at the same time. It's hard to always answer. The monotheism with Israel one, there might be some reasons why, but I don't know why it's happening in the Transjordan.
Right.
We just don't have the evidence, perhaps, to say why. But yeah, it's crazy how these sorts of things develop at the same times, perhaps from different places. They're just or for different reasons, but the development is the same, even if the impetus behind that development is not the same.
Right. Yeah. Now, do you feel like there are really great new discoveries out there, especially with the expansion of technology and the things we're able to access now? What's on the horizon?
Sure. Oh, man. I mean, just this past summer, with the help, because there are piles and piles of cuneiform tablets sitting in the back of every museum in the world that nobody's had time to
Nobody has time to go through.
And some of these learning technology, AI sorts of things are at least helping pinpoint which ones we should spend our time on. That's not just another receipt for sheep and goats. Yeah. And this summer, it seems that we have pinpointed a previously unknown language from the Hittite Empire. Right. So a new, perhaps Indo-European language, very important. Hittite's the earliest Indo-European language that we know. Right. So another one of those. The thing that I'm still hoping and praying for one day is that we find the capital of the Hurrian Empire, kingdom, whatever you want to call it, one of the big four kingdoms of the late Bronze Age, which we still don't know where the capital city was, and we still don't. Yeah, we still don't really know how to translate the Hurrian text that we have, because we don't have the right ones to really decipher the whole language. So I think there's always cool stuff on the horizon. We find new text every day. New texts are translated every day. Most of them are not important, but some of them are very important. I mentioned in our faculty meeting yesterday that just in the past few years, the beginning of this very, very well-known important text from ancient Egypt, the debate between a man and his ba, or the man and his soul, I think in 2017 was the beginning of that text found, which told us the whole the context behind why the entire text was written. Right. So, it's a cool field, because you never know what you're going to open your email today and what's going to have been found. For me, one of the interesting things is that we spend a lot of time debunking some of these things, because some people want them to be things that they're not. Right. My next project that I'm working on now is on King Hezekiah, and he was in the news a lot last year because all these new Hezekiah inscriptions were found. Mm-hmm. Well, I've been there. I've seen those walls they say they're on. Right. All my colleagues have been there and seen the walls they say these are on, but somebody said, no, look, I read all these letters and published it in a popular thing that didn't need to go through peer review, so now we have to deal with all of those. So it's both sides. There are things being found. Are they real or not? Right. That's another question. Right.
Well, and always there's that danger when you're finding things that are related to, or can be perceived as being related to the veracity of a biblical text, that people get up in arms.
Right. Yeah, that certainly happened in would have been like 2012, maybe it would have been earlier than that, at Khirbet Qeiyafa, which was right down the road from where I was excavating at the time. They found an inscription that they thought said the word David, and they just leveled the rest of the site to get down there quickly as they could, because we might have found David's kingdom, David's palace. Right. They didn't.
It wasn't David's.
It was David's palace. Some of them still think it is. I don't think it is.
Or at least not that David's palace.
Right. Another David.
That's right. You bring up field work, and I don't want to go too much into it because we're mostly kind of focusing on the textual work in your lectures, but you've obviously done field work.
Sure.
Is that something you enjoy, want to get back out there?
I'm glad I've had a lot of experience doing it. I would encourage anyone interested in this whatsoever to do it. Everyone's always looking for volunteers. Right. I got to the point where once my areas of interest became a bit more defined, that when you go out there, you don't know what you're going to find, right? So there would be summers where I had a lot of fun, but nothing was related at all to anything I was working on. So if I was able to join on to a project where I knew exactly what was there already, not kind of we're going to dig and see what we find, Maybe in that case.
Right.
But no more more from scratch, or no more, we don't even know what period this is. We'll see. And then it all ends up being Roman stuff, which is cool, but not something I work on.
Well, and also not something that's in particularly short supply.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Not saying we can't learn more about the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
But,
luckily in Israel and the Middle East, they care about the older stuff, so we find the Roman stuff, you just bust right through it.
just keep running off.
Yeah.
No, I do think there's this misconception out there that a lot of archaeology is, Indiana Jones with a book that he knows leads right to, the Holy Grail, as opposed to sort of like there's a mound, and inside the mound is a whole bunch of stuff from 1,000 years.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think, one misconception is that we find cool stuff, because most of the time we don't. But I will say, I think people are like, wow, do you actually find anything? We find tons of stuff. It's just all pottery, right? Tons of pottery. You never want to see another jar handle ever again in your life after you're there for a few weeks.
And I wanted to kind of do the last third of each of these podcasts by circling back to the classroom. And pottery is a good way to do that. Talk about doing pottery with your students and how you use that to help them understand the ancient world.
We do a lot of that, especially in my archaeology courses. We've done everything from making Egyptian Shabti figurines, which are these little figurines that, the wealthier you were, the more of them you had, because each one could work for you a day in the afterlife. So we make those. We learn how to write on clay tablets. So people make clay tablets and write on them. So that one, for me, has a very clear learning outcome of, look, you've never maybe even seen cuneiform in your life before today, and you just wrote a part of a tablet of Gilgamesh. Right. So what does that say about literacy? Did people who write these tablets, were they able to read them? Do you have to be able to read them? A lot of these, like making a Shabti figurine or making we call them Judean pillar figurines. These, I think they're figurines of this goddess Asherah that we find everywhere in Israel. You sat down, you didn't know who this was before today. You may have never played with clay before in your life before this semester. And you made something that looks enough like the real thing for me to know what it is. So are these skilled artisans making these things, or are people making them in their homes? And I think this is another way that I bring in we can't read text from non-elites in my class, but we can make objects that we commonly find with them. My students, we perform rituals sometimes, and things that I think were public, and then talk about if somebody's performing that and the rest of the class is sitting there watching that, like, what did that do for you as an audience? So I do try to bring as much of this, bring the ancient world into the classroom as much as we can. There are, thankfully, in 2024, lots of ways to do that just on the computer with digital reconstructions of sites. I always plug, people are into video games. We're sitting right beside a room with a lot of people playing video games right now. Assassin's Creed has the best reconstruction of ancient Egypt that you could ever possibly try to do, because they actually had money, which most academic projects don't have the funding like that behind them. So if you want to see what normal life looked like in ancient Egypt, go walk around. They're speaking Coptic like they would have been, and they are walking by the pyramids, and it's very, very cool.
They have a chapter that takes place in Palmyra, right?
Yep.
Where you could go to Palmyra.
And they actually, they had academics come work on these things with them, and things are to scale, and the language is correct. It's very cool.
And what do you want your students to take away from that experience? So what's the meaning of the ancient world and their engagement with the ancient world that you hope they carry out?
I think there's so many things. I mean, at the basis of everything for me is, first and foremost, realizing that people from 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago are real people, just like we are. And we look at text and we look at objects and realize that they're dealing with the same sorts of things that we're dealing with today. And then on a personal level, I want people to know that the beginnings of writing and everything were not in Greece and Rome. They were in the Middle East.
Well, as a scholar of Greece, I don't know that I want to go that far, but no, us Greek scholars have to admit that it was definitely the Greek engagement with the Phoenicians,
right?
That end of the Mediterranean that brought writing.
I had to get a jab in there, so
fairness dictates. I mean, that's where the alphabet comes from. We you know that much. Now, one part of your pedagogy is that you were recently named director of Wesleyan's Office of Undergraduate Research. Please tell us a little bit about what that means to you and what you want to do with that position. As someone who is an active researcher and doing research, how do you enact that with your undergraduates and carry that to undergraduates?
Sure. I mean, I feel like even once I was a Ph.D. student, I was still figuring out maybe not how to do research itself in the sense of where do I find journal articles and stuff like that, but I certainly still never got a lot of training on how to write a conference abstract, where to submit how to find where conferences are, how do you write a journal article, how do you submit that, how do you deal with peer review and things of that sort. So I think for folks who are maybe interested in going down that path, we need to start earlier so academia isn't so foreign and scary, because once you get, to a PhD program or even past that into a full-time job, you're kind of just thrown in the deep end and expected to figure it out on your own, and it doesn't need to be that way. So that's one thing that I'm interested in. I'm also interested in trying to show our students that academia is more than just sitting and teaching. We are active researchers, and trying to match up our students with folks who are in their area of study. And I think we have done a great job over the years here, especially in a few certain departments on the STEM side, with connecting undergrads with research opportunities. It is admittedly much more difficult on the humanities side. You do not expect undergraduates to be publishing things probably until their ABD in their PhD program or giving presentations or anything like that. But I don't think that has to be the case. So I think you can easily give undergrads some portions of your research that they are able to do, and to help you out, maybe get their name on something which would help them get into a program down the line. I'm just more interested in making research more visible on campus, both from a faculty and undergraduate side. So that is something that I am, only 2 months in, so not a ton's happened yet, but we'll get there.
You've just started.
Yeah.
And that leads to, what advice would you give to the undergraduate student who thinks they might want to go deep into the study of material culture in the biblical Near East? I mean, where do they begin if that's a subject of study that captures their imagination and they think, I want to know all there is to know about this? How do you get started?
Yeah, I think a good thing to do is go to Israel, go to the Middle East. You can get on a dig. It's not hard. You can spend, there are places you can go excavate for a day. There are places you can go spend 3 or 4 months. We're always looking for help. And I think try to absorb as much as possible. We are a unique field in that we're not specializing in 20 years of American history or something like that that's largely written in one language. We are all, as much as some folks don't want to admit it, generalists in the sense that we work on 3,000 to 4,000 years worth of history, from Anatolia to Iran to Egypt, and there are 30 to 40 different languages being spoken, and those languages are changing because there's a lot of time. And starting to look into what the history and the culture and religions are, and figuring out what's of interest to you, figuring out whether you like taking language courses and like other languages is a very important thing to realize.
Absolutely.
Whether you want to go down that path or not, because you're going to be spending a lot of time learning new to you languages, but very, very old languages. But I would encourage it. It's a difficult career to take if you're trying to break into the academic job market, and I think that's very well known at this point, but that doesn't mean that you can't be a student of things. Doesn't mean you can't go get a degree in these things just because you're interested. You most certainly can, and that can lead into all sorts of other avenues, from publishing to other forms of professional work, law school, whatever it may be, the priesthood, whatever. So there are so many different ways that you could take the study of the ancient world, and I hope some of my students have learned that in their classes with me over the years.
Well, I can assure you, just from talking with them, that there are a decent number of students who've been positively inspired by being in your class and having the opportunity craft figurines and fire them and occasionally break them.
Oh, yeah,
And
but we do get to set a fire on campus. We don't get to do that in any other class.
There you go. The one big advantage of Dr. Thompson's class. Well, I want to thank you very much, Shane, for being our first guest.
Sure, thanks for having me.
On the deep end at Wesleyan, and we really hope that we'll have the opportunity to have you back, maybe a little bit after the Kershaw lectures, talk about where your work's going next.
Sure.
And I want to thank you all for joining us and listening, and hope you found something inspiring that you would like to learn more about. So thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thanks. Awesome. That was fun.
That was good.